The rain came down in sheets, hammering the pavement of Seattle's Capitol Hill like a drumbeat of fate. Ezra Cole stood under the awning of a shuttered bookstore, his breath fogging in the cold, his heart pounding louder than the storm. He wasn't supposed to be here, not in this city, not in this moment, and certainly not waiting for a man who could unravel everything he'd fought to keep buried. Ezra was an Omega, a fact he'd learned to hide since he was old enough to understand the weight of it. In a world where alphas and omegas were bound by instinct, by scent, by an unspoken pull that could make or break lives, he'd chosen to run. He'd dyed his chestnut hair black, swapped his small-town Oregon roots for the anonymity of Seattle, and buried his true nature under suppressants and a carefully curated life. At 23, he was a barista by day, a dreamer by night, sketching stories in a worn notebook he kept hidden under his mattress. But tonight, he wasn't just Ezra, the quiet guy who made perfect lattes. Tonight, he was a substitute, a stand-in for someone else's life, someone else's love. The job had come through a cryptic text from his friend Lila, who ran a side hustle connecting omegas with alphas for discrete arrangements. It wasn't what it sounded like, not entirely. Sometimes, it was just about filling a space, playing a role. Tonight, Ezra was to meet an alpha named Julian Voss at this bookstore, pose as his date for a high-society gala, and disappear before anyone asked too many questions. Lila swore it was simple: smile, nod, don't get attached. But the way Ezra's pulse raced as he scanned the street for Julian told him this was anything but simple. A sleek black car pulled up, its headlights cutting through the rain like knives. Ezra's stomach twisted as the door opened, and a man stepped out. Julian Voss was taller than Ezra had imagined, his broad shoulders filling out a tailored coat, his dark blonde hair damp from the storm. His eyes, sharp, green, and impossibly intense, locked onto Ezra's with a force that made the world tilt. For a moment, neither spoke. The rain seemed to pause, the city holding its breath. "You're Ezra?" Julian's voice was low, steady, but there was an edge to it, like he was testing the air between them. Ezra nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, you're Julian." The alpha's gaze lingered, sweeping over Ezra's face, his damp jacket, the way his hands fidgeted at his sides. "You don't look like the usual type Lila sends," Julian said, not unkindly, but with a curiosity that made Ezra's skin prickle. "I'm just here for the job," Ezra replied, forcing a smile. "One night, right?" Julian's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but something softer. "One night," he echoed, stepping closer. His scent hit Ezra then, cedarwood and something warmer, like amber, cutting through the rain. It was the kind of scent that could unravel an Omega's defenses, and Ezra gripped his jacket tighter, willing his suppressants to hold. They drove in silence to the gala, the city blurring past the car's tinted windows. Ezra stole glances at Julian, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped restlessly against the steering wheel. This wasn't just a rich guy needing a date for show. There was something deeper, something unspoken, and Ezra felt it like a current pulling him under. The gala was held in a glittering ballroom atop a downtown hotel, all crystal chandeliers and champagne flutes. Ezra felt out of place in his borrowed suit, the fabric stiff against his skin, but Julian's hand brushed his elbow as they entered, grounding him. "Stay close," Julian murmured, his breath warm against Ezra's ear. "And don't let them intimidate you." Them turned out to be a sea of alphas and betas, their eyes sharp with judgment, their smiles too perfect to be genuine. Julian introduced Ezra as his partner, the words slipping from his lips with an ease that made Ezra's chest ache. It was a lie, of course, just part of the act, but the way Julian's hand rested lightly on Ezra's back felt too real, too possessive. As the night wore on, Ezra played his role. He laughed at the right moments, nodded through small talk about stocks and politics, and ignored the curious glances that lingered on his too pale skin and slightly crooked nose. But he couldn't ignore Julian. The alpha was magnetic, drawing every eye in the room, yet his attention kept drifting back to Ezra. A shared glance during a boring speech, a subtle touch when passing a drink, a quiet, "You're doing better than I expected," that felt like a secret meant just for them. By midnight, Ezra's head was spinning, not from the champagne, but from the weight of Julian's gaze. They stepped onto a balcony overlooking the city, the cool air a relief after the stuffy ballroom. Ezra leaned against the railing, his heart racing as Julian stood beside him, closer than necessary. "Why do you need a substitute?" Ezra asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. "You could have anyone here." Julian's expression darkened, his eyes fixed on the skyline. "It's complicated," he said after a long pause. "My family, they expect things. A certain kind of partner. A certain kind of life." Ezra swallowed, his Omega instincts flaring despite the suppressants. "And I'm just the stand-in." Julian turned to him, his gaze piercing. "You're more than that," he said softly, and the words hung between them like a promise or a warning. Ezra wanted to ask what he meant, but the moment was broken by a sharp voice calling Julian's name. A woman in a red dress strode onto the balcony, her eyes narrowing as they landed on Ezra. "Julian, darling, you've been hiding," she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "And who's this?" "Ezra," Julian said, his voice firm. "My date." The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Charming. But we need to talk, alone." Julian hesitated, his hand brushing Ezra's arm as if to reassure him. "Stay here," he said quietly. "I'll be back." As Julian followed the woman inside, Ezra stood alone, the city lights blurring below. He was just a substitute, he reminded himself. Just a role to play. But the way Julian had looked at him, the way his touch lingered, made Ezra wonder if he could ever go back to being invisible. Ezra's fingers tightened around the balcony railing, the cold metal grounding him as the woman's sharp laughter echoed from inside. The gala's hum felt distant now, a world he didn't belong to. He glanced at his reflection in the glass door, dark hair falling into his eyes, the borrowed suit hanging slightly too loose on his frame, and wondered how he'd ended up here, caught in a story that wasn't his. Julian returned minutes later, his expression stormy. "Sorry about that," he said, his voice tight. "That was Vanessa, my sister's advisor. She's got opinions about everything." Ezra forced a smile, brushing off the unease creeping up his spine. "She doesn't seem to like me." "She doesn't like anyone who isn't part of her plan," Julian muttered, running a hand through his hair. He stepped closer, his scent enveloping Ezra again, warm and dizzying. "You okay?" "Yeah," Ezra lied, his heart tripping over itself. "Just not used to this kind of crowd." Julian studied him, his green eyes searching. "You're doing better than most would. This world, it chews people up. But you've got something real about you." Ezra's breath caught. He wanted to laugh it off, to remind Julian he was just a hired stand-in, but the sincerity in the alpha's voice stopped him. Instead, he turned back to the city, letting the silence stretch. "What's the deal with your family?" he asked finally. "Why all this pretense?" Julian leaned against the railing beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. "My family runs Voss Enterprises. Old money, big expectations. They want me to settle down, produce an heir, keep the legacy going. But I'm not," he trailed off, his jaw tightening. "I'm not what they want." Ezra glanced at him, curiosity overriding his caution. "What do you mean?" Julian's eyes met his, raw and unguarded. "I'm an alpha, sure, but I don't want the life they've mapped out. The perfect Omega, the perfect family, the perfect lie. I want something real, something that feels like this." His gaze lingered on Ezra, heavy with meaning. Ezra's pulse raced. He should have backed away, should have reminded himself this was just a job. But the air between them crackled, and for the first time in years, he felt seen. Not as an Omega, not as a substitute, but as himself. The moment shattered when Julian's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression hardening. "I have to deal with this," he said, his voice clipped. "Stay here. Don't go anywhere." Ezra nodded, watching as Julian disappeared into the crowd. Alone again, he felt the weight of the night pressing in. He wasn't supposed to care about Julian, wasn't supposed to feel the pull of his scent or the ache of his words. But as he stood there, the city sprawling below, he couldn't shake the feeling that this night was about to change everything. The gala dragged on, and Ezra found himself fielding questions from curious guests. "How did you meet Julian?" a woman in a sparkling gown asked, her smile too sharp. Ezra mumbled something vague about mutual friends, his eyes scanning for Julian. When the alpha finally returned, his face was a mask of control, but his hand found Ezra's elbow again, guiding him through the crowd. "We're leaving," Julian said quietly, his tone leaving no room for argument. The car ride back was tense, the silence thick with unspoken questions. Ezra stole glances at Julian, noting the way his hands gripped the wheel, the faint crease between his brows. "What happened back there?" Ezra asked, unable to hold back. Julian's jaw tightened. "Family business. Nothing you need to worry about." But Ezra did worry. He worried about the way Julian's scent lingered on his skin, the way his own omega instincts were clawing to the surface despite years of suppression. He worried about the way he wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap between them. They pulled up outside Ezra's apartment, a modest building tucked between a laundromat and a taco shop. Julian turned off the engine, the sudden silence deafening. "You did good tonight," he said, his voice softer now. "Better than I expected." Ezra managed a small smile. "Thanks. I had fun. Sort of." Julian's lips curved, a real smile this time. "Sort of. Okay, maybe more than sort of," Ezra admitted, his cheeks warming. He reached for the door handle, but Julian's hand caught his wrist, gentle but firm. "Wait," Julian said, his voice low. "Can I see you again?" Ezra froze, his heart hammering. "This was just a job," he said, the words tasting like ash. "One night, remember?" Julian's grip tightened slightly, his eyes searching Ezra's. "It doesn't have to be." For a moment, Ezra couldn't breathe. He wanted to say yes, to lean into the warmth of Julian's touch, but fear clawed at him. He'd spent years hiding who he was, running from the pull of alphas and the expectations of his biology. Letting Julian in meant risking everything. "I need to think about it," Ezra said finally, pulling his wrist free and stepping out into the rain. Julian didn't stop him, but his gaze followed Ezra all the way to the door, heavy with promise and something deeper, something that made Ezra believe, just for a moment, that he could be more than a substitute. Ezra barely slept that night, his mind replaying Julian's words, his touch, the way his green eyes seemed to see straight through him. By morning, his apartment felt too small, the walls closing in as he paced, his sketchbook abandoned on the coffee table. He told himself it was just the adrenaline of the gala, the thrill of stepping into someone else's world. But deep down, he knew it was more. Julian had cracked something open inside him, and now the pieces were spilling out, impossible to contain. He checked his phone obsessively, half expecting a message from Lila, half hoping for one from Julian. When his phone finally buzzed, it was Lila, her text blunt. "How'd it go?" "Client's happy. Wants you for another job. You in?" Ezra stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the reply. Another job meant seeing Julian again, stepping back into that electric pull. It also meant risking his carefully guarded life. He typed "I need a day to think" and hit send, his stomach churning. The day passed in a blur of coffee shop shifts and half-hearted sketches. By evening, Ezra found himself wandering Capitol Hill, the streets alive with buskers and neon signs. He stopped outside the bookstore where he'd met Julian, the memory of that night vivid enough to make his chest ache. He was about to turn away when a familiar voice called his name. "Ezra." He turned, his breath catching. Julian stood there, no longer in a tailored coat, but in a simple sweater and jeans, his hair slightly mussed. He looked less like the untouchable alpha from the gala, and more like someone Ezra could reach out and touch, if he dared. "What are you doing here?" Ezra asked, his voice betraying his nerves. Julian stepped closer, his hands in his pockets. "I was hoping I'd run into you. Lila said you live around here." Ezra's eyes narrowed. "You asked Lila about me?" Julian's lips twitched. "Guilty. I couldn't stop thinking about you." The admission hit Ezra like a punch, stealing his breath. He wanted to laugh, to brush it off as a line, but Julian's eyes were too honest, too raw. "You don't even know me," Ezra said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then let me," Julian replied, stepping closer still. "One coffee. That's all I'm asking." Against his better judgment, Ezra nodded. They ended up at a tiny cafe down the street, tucked into a corner booth with mismatched mugs and the scent of roasted beans. Over coffee, Julian talked, not about his family or the gala, but about small things, his love for old jazz records, the way he'd sneak away to hike in the Cascades when the city felt too heavy. Ezra found himself opening up too, sharing stories of late-night sketching sessions and the small-town life he'd left behind. "You're an artist," Julian said, his eyes lighting up as Ezra described his sketches. "Can I see them sometime?" Ezra hesitated, his instincts screaming to keep that part of himself hidden. But Julian's smile was disarming, and before he knew it, he was nodding. "Maybe, if you're lucky." Julian laughed, a sound that warmed Ezra from the inside out. For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe, like he didn't have to hide every piece of himself. But the ease didn't last. As they left the cafe, Julian's phone buzzed again, and his expression darkened. "I have to go," he said, his voice tight. "Family stuff." Ezra nodded, trying to ignore the pang in his chest. "Sure, I'll see you around." Julian's hand brushed his, lingering just long enough to send a shiver through Ezra. "You will," he said, his voice a promise. Back at his apartment, Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something dangerous. He pulled out his sketchbook, his pencil moving almost on its own, tracing the lines of Julian's face. The sharp jaw, the intense eyes, the hint of a smile that felt like it was meant just for him. When he finally set the pencil down, the sketch was more than a portrait. It was a confession, a map of the feelings he wasn't ready to name. The next morning, Lila called, her voice sharp with urgency. "Ezra, you in or out? Julian's asking for you specifically. Another event, this weekend. Big one." Ezra's heart skipped. "What's the catch?" Lila sighed. "His family's gonna be there. They're intense. You sure you're up for this?" Ezra thought of Julian's gaze, the way it made him feel like he could be more than a substitute. "I'm in," he said, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. The weekend arrived too quickly, and Ezra found himself in another borrowed suit, standing outside a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of Seattle. The estate belonged to Julian's family, a monument to wealth and power that made Ezra's stomach churn. He adjusted his tie, his fingers trembling, and reminded himself why he was here. One more job, one more night. But the memory of Julian's touch, his voice, made it hard to believe this was just business. Julian met him at the gate, his expression a mix of relief and tension. "You came," he said, his voice softer than Ezra expected. "Didn't have much choice," Ezra replied, trying for a joke, but his smile faltered under Julian's gaze. "You always have a choice," Julian said, his hand brushing Ezra's as they walked toward the mansion. "I'm glad you chose this." The event was a family dinner, though dinner hardly captured the scale of it. The dining hall was a sea of polished wood and candlelight, filled with Voss family members and their allies, all alphas and betas with sharp eyes and sharper tongues. Ezra felt their scrutiny the moment he stepped inside, Julian's hand on his back the only thing keeping him grounded. Julian's mother, Eleanor Voss, was the first to approach. Her silver hair was swept into an elegant updo, her smile as cold as the diamonds around her neck. "Julian, darling, introduce us," she said, her eyes raking over Ezra. "This is Ezra," Julian said, his tone firm. "My partner." The words sent a jolt through Ezra, even though he knew it was part of the act. Eleanor's smile didn't waver, but her eyes narrowed. "Charming," she said, her tone dripping with skepticism. "And what do you do, Ezra?" "I'm an artist," Ezra said, surprising himself with the truth. "And a barista." Eleanor's laugh was sharp, cutting. "How quaint." Julian's hand tightened on Ezra's back, a silent warning. "Ezra's talented," he said, his voice low but steady. "You'd be surprised what he's capable of." The dinner was a minefield of subtle insults and probing questions. Julian's sister, Vanessa, the woman from the gala, sat across from them, her gaze flicking between Ezra and Julian with barely concealed disdain. "Julian, you've been so secretive lately," she said, swirling her wine. "Tell us, how did you two meet?" Ezra froze, but Julian's hand found his under the table, squeezing gently. "Through a friend," Julian said smoothly. Sometimes you find what you need when you least expect it. The words felt like they were meant for Ezra alone, and he clung to them as the night wore on. But the tension in the room was palpable, a storm brewing beneath the polished surface. When dessert was served, Vanessa leaned forward, her smile predatory. Ezra, you must tell us more about yourself. Where are you from? What's your background? Ezra's heart pounded. He knew what she was fishing for, his status, his designation. Omegas were rare, coveted, and often judged. He'd spent years hiding his truth, but under Vanessa's gaze, he felt exposed. I'm from Oregon, he said, keeping his voice steady. Small town. Not much to tell. Vanessa's smile widened, like a cat cornering a mouse. Oh, I'm sure there's more to you than that. Before Ezra could respond, Julian stood, his chair scraping against the floor. That's enough, he said, his voice cutting through the room. Ezra's here with me. That's all you need to know. The table fell silent, all eyes on Julian. Eleanor's lips thinned, but she said nothing. Vanessa's smile faltered, but she leaned back, conceding, for now. Later, as they stepped into the mansion's garden for air, Ezra's legs felt unsteady. You didn't have to do that, he said, his voice quiet. Stand up for me like that. Julian turned to him, his expression fierce. Yes, I did. They don't get to treat you like that. Ezra's chest tightened. I'm just the substitute, Julian. You don't have to. You're not just anything. Julian interrupted, stepping closer. His hand cupped Ezra's cheek, his touch warm and steady. You're here. You're real. And I want you here. Ezra's breath hitched, his Omega instincts roaring to life. He wanted to lean into Julian's touch, to let himself believe this could be real. But fear held him back, a lifetime of running from who he was. I don't know how to do this, Ezra admitted, his voice breaking. I've spent so long hiding. Julian's thumb brushed his cheek, gentle but firm. Then stop hiding. Just for tonight. Ezra closed his eyes, letting the warmth of Julian's touch anchor him. For the first time, he didn't feel like a substitute. He felt like he belonged. The garden was a quiet oasis, the city's hum muted by towering hedges and the soft glow of lanterns. Ezra stood frozen, Julian's hand still on his cheek, the alpha's gaze pulling him in like a tide. He wanted to say something, to break the spell, but his voice failed him. All he could do was lean into Julian's touch, letting the moment stretch until it felt like the world might crack open. We should go back inside, Ezra said finally, his voice barely audible. They'll notice we're gone. Julian's hand dropped, but his eyes didn't waver. Let them notice. I'm done playing their games. Ezra's heart raced. What does that mean? It means I'm tired of pretending, Julian said, his voice low and fierce. Pretending I want their life, their rules. Pretending you're just a stand-in when you're. He stopped, his jaw tightening as if the words were too heavy to speak. When I'm what? Ezra pressed, his voice trembling with hope and fear. Julian stepped closer, his scent enveloping Ezra, cedarwood and amber, warm and intoxicating. When you're the first thing that's felt right in years. Ezra's breath caught, his Omega instincts screaming to close the distance, to let Julian's warmth consume him. But years of hiding held him back, a wall he'd built brick by brick. You don't know what you're saying, he whispered. I'm an Omega, Julian. You know what that means. The expectations, the bond. I know, Julian said, his voice steady. And I don't care about their expectations. I care about you. The words hit Ezra like a wave, threatening to pull him under. He wanted to believe them, wanted to let himself fall, but the fear was too strong. I can't, he said, stepping back. I can't be what you need. Julian's face fell, but he didn't push. You don't have to be anything, he said softly. Just be you. They returned to the dinner, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. Ezra felt the weight of every glance, every whispered conversation. Vanessa's eyes followed him, sharp and calculating, but Julian stayed close, his presence a shield against the storm. As the night ended, Julian drove Ezra back to his apartment. The silence in the car was different now, charged with everything they hadn't said. When they pulled up outside Ezra's building, Julian turned to him, his expression unreadable. I meant what I said, Julian told him. I want to see you again. Not as a job. As you. Ezra's heart pounded, but he couldn't find the words. Instead, he nodded, slipping out of the car and into the rain. He didn't look back, afraid of what he'd see in Julian's eyes. The next few days were a blur. Ezra threw himself into his work at the coffee shop, sketching in stolen moments, trying to drown out the memory of Julian's touch. But every quiet moment brought it back. The warmth of his hand, the intensity of his gaze, the promise of something more. Lila called again, her voice cautious. Julian's been asking about you. Says it's not about the job anymore. You okay with that? Ezra's throat tightened. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know what I'm doing. Lila sighed. Be careful, Ezra. He's an alpha. They don't always play fair. Ezra knew she was right, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Julian was different. That night, he pulled out his sketchbook, flipping to the portrait of Julian. He added details, the curve of his smile, the shadow of his lashes, until the page felt alive with him. When his phone buzzed with an unknown number, Ezra's heart skipped. The message was simple. It's Julian. Can we talk? Ezra stared at the screen, his fingers trembling. He typed a reply, then deleted it. Typed again, then deleted. Finally, he sent a single word. Okay. They met at the same cafe, the familiarity of it easing Ezra's nerves. Julian looked different in the daylight, less guarded, his smile softer. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said, sliding into the booth across from Ezra. I wasn't sure either, Ezra admitted, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug. It's a lot. Julian nodded, his eyes steady. I know, and I'm not asking you to decide anything now. I just want to know you, Ezra, the real you. Ezra's chest ached with the weight of those words. For so long, he'd hidden his omega nature, his dreams, his heart. But with Julian, he felt the edges of that wall crumbling, and it terrified him as much as it thrilled him. Okay, Ezra said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Let's try. Julian's smile was like sunlight breaking through clouds, and for the first time, Ezra let himself hope that maybe, just maybe, he could be more than a substitute. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of stolen moments and quiet revelations. Ezra and Julian met whenever they could, coffee shops, late-night walks, a hidden bench in a park overlooking Puget Sound. Each meeting chipped away at Ezra's defenses, Julian's presence a steady warmth that made him feel safe in a way he hadn't since he was a child. But with every moment they spent together, the weight of Ezra's secret grew heavier. He hadn't told Julian he was an Omega. The suppressants kept his scent muted, his instincts buried, but they couldn't erase the truth. Every time Julian's hand brushed his, every time their eyes met, Ezra felt the pull of his biology, the bond that could form between an alpha and an omega. He wanted to tell Julian, to lay everything bare, but the fear of rejection, of being seen as less, kept him silent. One evening, they ended up at Julian's apartment, a sleek loft with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the city skyline. Ezra felt out of place among the modern furniture and expensive art, but Julian's smile put him at ease. They cooked dinner together, laughing over burnt pasta and spilled wine, and for a moment, Ezra let himself forget the world outside. After dinner, they sat on the couch, a jazz record spinning softly in the background. Julian's arm rested across the back of the couch, his fingers brushing Ezra's shoulder. You're quiet tonight, Julian said, his voice gentle. Everything okay? Ezra nodded, but his throat was tight. Just thinking. About what? Julian's hand moved to Ezra's, his touch warm and steady. Ezra's heart pounded. He wanted to tell Julian everything, his past, his fears, his truth. But the words stuck, heavy and unyielding. Instead, he leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and kissed Julian. The kiss was tentative at first, a question, but Julian responded with a hunger that took Ezra's breath away, his hands cupping Ezra's face, pulling him closer. The world fell away, leaving only the heat of Julian's touch, the taste of him, the scent that made Ezra's instincts roar. When they pulled apart, Ezra's head was spinning. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice shaking. I shouldn't have. Don't, Julian said, his voice rough. Don't apologize. I've wanted to do that since the night we met. Ezra's eyes burned, the weight of his secret pressing down. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I'm scared." Julian's expression softened, his hand finding Ezra's again. "Whatever it is, you can tell me. I'm not going anywhere." Ezra took a deep breath, his heart hammering. "I'm an Omega," he said, the words spilling out like a confession. "I've been hiding it, taking suppressants. I didn't want you to know because I didn't want you to see me differently." Julian was silent for a moment, his eyes searching Ezra's. Then he leaned forward, pressing his forehead to Ezra's. "I don't care," he said softly. "Omega, Beta, Alpha, it doesn't change who you are to me." Ezra's breath hitched, tears prickling his eyes. "You don't understand. Omegas were supposed to be something specific. Submissive, perfect, bound to an alpha. I've spent my life running from that." Julian's hand tightened on his. "Then run to me," he said, his voice fierce. "Not because you're an Omega, but because you're Ezra, the guy who sketches stories in a notebook, who makes terrible coffee puns, who makes me feel like I can breathe for the first time in years." Ezra laughed through his tears, the sound raw and shaky. "You're making it really hard to keep running." "Good," Julian said, his smile soft. "Stay." They kissed again, slower this time, and Ezra let himself believe, just for a moment, that he could. But the world outside wasn't done with them. The next morning, Ezra woke to a text from Lila. "Trouble. Vanessa's digging into you. Be careful." Ezra's stomach dropped. Vanessa's suspicion at the dinner, her sharp questions, they weren't just curiosity. She was looking for something, and Ezra had a sinking feeling she'd find it. The days that followed were a tightrope walk between hope and fear. Ezra and Julian grew closer, their connection deepening with every shared moment. But the shadow of Vanessa's investigation loomed large. Ezra felt it in the way his phone buzzed with cryptic messages from Lila, in the way Julian's jaw tightened when he mentioned his family. They were running out of time, and Ezra knew it. One evening, Julian took Ezra to a quiet overlook in the Cascades, the city a distant glow below. They sat on a blanket, the stars bright above, and Ezra felt the weight of his secret lift, replaced by something new, something that felt like home. "I told my mother about us," Julian said, his voice quiet. "Not everything, but enough. She's not happy." Ezra's heart sank. "Because I'm an Omega?" "Because you're not what she planned," Julian said, his hand finding Ezra's. "But I don't care about her plans. I care about you." Ezra wanted to believe him, but the fear was still there, sharp and cold. What if they find out? About the suppressants, about me being a substitute? Julian's eyes were fierce. "Then we face it together." The next day, Vanessa's trap sprang. Ezra was at the coffee shop when two men in suits approached, their expressions cold. "Ezra Cole," one asked, his voice clipped. "We need to talk." They took him to a sleek office downtown, where Vanessa waited, her smile as sharp as ever. "You've been playing a dangerous game, Ezra," she said, tossing a file onto the desk. Inside were photos, Ezra at the gala, at the cafe, even outside his apartment. "A hired Omega, passing yourself off as Julian's partner. Did you think we wouldn't find out?" Ezra's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'm not passing myself off as anything. Julian knows who I am." Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "Does he? Because I doubt he'd be so smitten if he knew the truth about your little arrangement with Lila." Ezra's stomach twisted, but before he could respond, the door opened, and Julian stormed in, his face a mask of fury. "Enough, Vanessa," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "This ends now." Vanessa laughed, but it was brittle. "Julian, you can't be serious. He's a fraud." "He's mine," Julian said, the words cutting through the room. He turned to Ezra, his eyes softening. "And I'm his." Ezra's breath caught, the world narrowing to Julian's gaze. In that moment, he knew he was done running. He stood, stepping closer to Julian, their hands finding each other. "I'm not a substitute anymore," Ezra said, his voice steady. "I'm here. For real." Vanessa's face twisted, but she said nothing, her power crumbling under the weight of their truth. Julian pulled Ezra close, his scent enveloping him, and for the first time, Ezra felt like he belonged, not as an Omega, not as a stand-in, but as himself. They left the office together, the city stretching out before them. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Julian's family, the expectations, the world they lived in would fight them at every turn. But as Julian's hand tightened around his, Ezra knew they'd face it together. He wasn't just a substitute anymore. He was home.